It's been a long time since we visited ancient Rome. Friends, it's time to go back. We now propose to delve into the maze of the slave system of the Republic and Empire. And in the next couple of minutes, with our traditional guest, we're going to be plunged into a very different, but also very similar to our own world, where a slave can be richer than a citizen. A citizen may himself ask to be a slave, and the chains on the hands of forced laborers are matched with diamonds. It's going to be very interesting, so please welcome our guest, Costas. He lives in Rome, and of course he's a slave. We're not going to set an exact time frame this time, because we'd like to go through the stories of slaves from various points in the life of the Roman Republic, and then the Empire. Our Costas's name, as you have already understood, is Greek. And this is not surprising, because a huge part of the slaves in Rome at one time were Greeks. In the last centuries BC, Rome conquered Greece and brought them as war trophies, and later the Greeks went bankrupt and voluntarily went into slavery. Or they raised an uprising, after which, as you might guess, they also fell into slavery. Maybe that's what happened to our Costas, and not to say that his story stirred the blood so much in Roman times. After all, first of all, we do not talk about slaves as such. The term slavery itself was coined much later, and the word itself has not been something shameful for a significant part of human history. The origin of the word varies in different languages. In English, the word slave is generally similar to the designation of the Slavs. And this is not a coincidence. The source of the two terms is the same, the Latin designation of the people, which, due to numerous wars and captivity, merged, so that later it was necessary to separate the words. Differentiating the Slavs as a people and slaves as a separate category of people, and the very negative definition of the exploitation of one person by another lies either in the Renaissance or in general in Karl Marx. Historians still agree on this issue in fierce battles. Well, for our Costas, the reality is that in Rome, as in ancient Egypt and other ancient countries, what we call slavery was not something bad by default. It just was and was a part of people's lives. Just like now, a man working for a minimum wage would be no different from a slave in the eyes of a Roman. In Rome, our Costas and his kind are not even called by a single term. It is now that we do not hesitate to qualify all people who were disenfranchised at that time as slaves, but depending on the era of Rome, the employment of a person and his qualifications, the position of the so-called slave varied. There were managers, ordinary, rural workers have the surname rustica, urban surname urbana, educated literati, and many, many others. The closest collective Latin term for slaves is servi, but now any translator will translate him as a slave. In Roman times, words could be interpreted as a servant, as confidants, and as property. In general, everything is very difficult, especially since there were free people, clienti, in life more like slaves, and slaves with piculius, in life more like rich people. But more about them later. In the meantime, let's get back to our Costas. Legally, he is not even a human being. A slave in ancient Rome was the property of the master, and the children of the slave, even newborns, too. In the days of the Republic, everything was really terrible with this. A slave could easily be killed, tortured, beaten, sold into sexual slavery, and used as a thing. According to the law that Aquilius issued, even the testimony of a slave in court legally made as much sense as the barking of a dog. Things got a little better during the Empire. In the 47th year, a law was introduced giving freedom to slaves who are not cared for in case of illness. In the 64th year, they were prohibited from sending people to fight against wild animals. In the 2nd century, the sale of slaves for prostitution and their arbitrary killing was banned. Later, everything became even stricter and in general as we approached the end of existence. Rome was becoming more loyal to slaves, but of course this is all on paper, and in life you could meet both a perfectly living slave in times of lawlessness and a dying slave in times of state protection. And do not forget that a person does not have a legal title. It also meant that our Costas owed nothing to anyone. and the owner had to deal with any problems for him. And at this point, let's move on to work. Dutch scientist Pampa counted 147 functions that slaves could perform only in the master's house. Now you can find numerous classifications with thousands of different positions, but the easiest way to say that slaves in ancient Rome did everything, literally. Our Costas, being educated by the Greeks, was highly appreciated, and he can easily teach the children of the owner or even help him with paperwork, taxes, and business. It could even be so. If the owner of our Costas is a merchant, then a slave can safely perform the functions of captain of one of the ships and have free people under his command. This makes sense, because in case of problems, a slave can be punished in the most cruel ways, while you can't do much to a hired Roman citizen. The same thing happened in all areas, and we can safely say that slaves were the basis of Rome's economy. However, scientists still doubt their number. After all, the population censuses at that time were conducted only for citizens and did not even count children, and it was difficult to calculate what percentage were slaves. Bold estimates reach up to half of the population, while, as the conservatives claim, only about 10% of the inhabitants of Rome were slaves. But in any case, everything depended on these slaves. For example, agriculture flourished on slaves almost completely. There were guys like Plinius maintained plantations for 4,000 slaves, and the conditions there were terrible. Most often, slaves in agriculture slept in chains inside a gestillum, or roughly speaking a prison, from where they only came out to work and often worked to death. How hard it was for the workers in the fields is best evidenced by the fact that the same Plinius openly boasted that he allowed slaves to sleep without chains. This was considered an incredible act of kindness in the agricultural sector. Indeed, often such slaves did rise up in rebellions, with Spartacus being a prominent example. He did not gather a 100,000-strong army without reason. A significant portion of his army consisted precisely of enslaved farmers who had become disillusioned with their harsh lives. But you can't even call them record holders, because there were also miners who worked in about the same conditions, only they didn't even have enough strength to rebel, because the guys rarely lived even to 30. A relatively average part of the slaves in terms of quality of life worked for the state and belonged to it. They slept most often in chains too and worked on the construction of roads, aqueducts, and other general national projects. Of course, no slave in Rome could receive a salary. Unlike in Greece, where slaves were paid at one time, legally this was not possible in Rome. It's like paying for household furniture or pets. But at the same time, there was a downside. In general, the attitude towards a person who treats slaves badly was the same as now for those who treat pets badly. From a human point of view, slaves were still considered human beings. And thanks to a legal loophole, a paradoxical situation could well have developed. The loophole is called peculium. In short, this is an analog of a modern power of attorney. In more detail, for example, our Costas may have an excellent relationship with its owner. Let's say he worked as an accountant and showed him that he could run a business. The owner, T.S., in turn, seeing the slave's commercial streak, issued a store for him through peculium, and thus, legally, the slave still had nothing. The store remained with the owner, but at the same time it was managed entirely by the slave, earning money for both the owner and himself. So from time to time, slaves appeared, whose condition could be envied by free citizens. A little later, the peculium concept was expanded for money, allowing slaves to earn extra money on the side. Everything again rested on the host, where, as always in human history, there were both good people are still not very good. Historian Alex Mann generally cites an analogy with the modern games of the rich. Slaves and their quantity and quality were analogs of modern Rolex and Lamborghini. The status of a person was determined by their quantity and quality, and if one slave served lunch in the house and another dessert, then this is not a very rich person. The rich could afford, imagine a well-dressed and well-groomed slave whose task is only to open the door. In history, there were even wealthy individuals who pursued prestige and would acquire separate slaves for specific attire. That is, there was a slave in the house. He ate well and lived, whose only task was to put on a purple toga. And if the owner decided to wear a different outfit today, it became the task of another slave. This idea went even further, and the wealthy individuals started simply parading all their slaves around, boasting about their quantity and quality. Whatever one may say, the slave's life was influenced for the better. A little later, the custom went completely crazy, and the rich began to recruit free citizens for such ostentation. This arms race has also affected the most important moment for our Costas, the moment of gaining freedom. Historians generally agree that slaves in ancient Rome obtained their freedom quite frequently through various means, and an emancipated slave in Rome was not something rare, except for the poor individuals working in the fields and mines who were an exception, and the same rich people in general periodically demonstrated wealth by freeing slaves in bundles and showing off in front of each other. Along the way, educated or useful slaves accumulated enough money with the help of the above-mentioned peculium. Someone received freedom or money as a gift, and someone could be released by the state on the occasion of special holidays. Summarizing all of the above, I would like to remind you once again what times were in the yard. Human life is worth little now, and a couple thousand years ago it was worth nothing at all. Just like our standard of living is now disproportionately higher than in ancient times. And the topic of slavery should be approached without imposing assessments and criteria of modernity on society of the past. Children who worked in factories in Germany for pennies at the end of the 19th century were not legally called slaves, but in fact they were more slaves than the average ancient Roman slave. Of course, this does not negate the harsh conditions in which most slaves lived in ancient Rome, but you should never forget that formulations are a purely paper issue, and the life of societies in ancient times are complex structures that cannot be separated by simple criteria and formulations. See you soon, friends.